Vorkth had never lost a war, not once. Not even close, in 40 years of service. To the Draki Dominion, he had led his fleets into 23 conflicts and walked away from every single one with a new system. Under Draki control, he was not the kind of commander who got lucky. He was the kind of commander who did not need luck. He had something better. He had the Codex. The Codex of Engagement was the most sacred document in the known galaxy. It was older than most civilizations still alive today. It had been written, rewritten, agreed upon, and signed by over 200 species across 6 centuries. It told every military force in the galaxy exactly how war was supposed to work, when to declare it, how to declare it, what was allowed, what was not allowed, how to surrender, how to accept a surrender. Every step, every rule at every boundary, all of it written down clearly so that war, as terrible as it was, could at least be conducted in an orderly and civilized manner. Every species followed it. That was simply how things were done. Vorkth had built his entire career on the Codex. He trusted it the way he trusted gravity. It was not just a rule book to him. It was the foundation of everything he knew about how intelligent beings behaved when they were trying to kill each other. So when his long reign scouts detected a new species near the edge of the outer rim, he was not especially concerned. The scans came back with unremarkable results. Small bipedal creatures, soft bodies, no natural armor, no energy shielding on their vessels. Their technology was decent but nothing extraordinary. Their population numbers were manageable, and their home system had one inhabited planet, a few small outposts, and a handful of ships that looked like they had been assembled from mismatched parts. By every measure, this was going to be a routine operation. He assigned the mission to Subcommander Zor, one of his more capable junior officers, and gave him a mid-tier fleet of 30 warships. More than enough, he told ZTH-Nor to follow the Codex exactly, issue the formal declaration, wait the required 7 days, and then proceed with standard engagement protocols. ZTH-Nor followed the Codex to the letter. He positioned his fleet at the agreed diplomatic distance, activated the Universal Translation Array, and broadcast the formal declaration of war in the clearest possible signal. And the message stated that the Draki Dominion was claiming sovereignty over the contested Outer Rim territory. It stated that the human species had 7 standard days to either surrender and accept terms or prepare for engagement. It stated that all rules of the Codex of Engagement would be observed. It was polite, formal, and had been delivered in exactly the same way to dozens of species before. Then he waited for the response. What came back was not what he expected. The voice on the other end belonged to a human named Dan Holloway, captain of a vessel called the Defiant Cause. He sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. He thanked ZTH-No for the message and said it had come through very clearly. Then he asked 2 questions. His first question was whether the 7-day notice period was a hard rule or more of a guideline, because his crew had already started a betting pool and some of them were hoping things could get started a little sooner. His second question was whether the Dreki fleet accepted formal challenges, because one of his gunners, a man named Eddie Graves, wanted to know if he could personally challenge a Dreki pilot to a one-on-one engagement for fun separate from the main conflict. ZTH-Nor sat in silence for a long moment. He filed his first report to Von Kath. That same hour, he described the exchange in full detail and noted that he believed there may have been a translation error. He recommended a diagnostic check on the universal array. Before proceeding further, Von Kath read the report and ordered the diagnostic. The array was functioning perfectly. There was no translation error, and he told Zethner to send a corrected transmission restating the declaration in simpler terms and to make clear that this was not an invitation for casual conversation. ZTH-Nor sent the corrected transmission. The humans responded within 4 minutes. This time it was not just a voice message, they also sent a file attachment. The translation array identified the attachment as an image. When ZTH-Nor opened it, he saw a small, furry creature from what appeared to be the human home world. The creature was photographed in the middle of what looked like a violent confrontation with a much larger animal. The small creature appeared to be winning. Beneath the image was a line of text. It read, "We have seen worse. See you in 7 days." There was no further communication. ZTH filed a second report. This one was longer. Then he described the image, careful detail, and noted that he was unsure whether it was meant as a threat, a joke, or some kind of cultural greeting. He said that in 20 years of military service, no species had ever sent him a picture of a small animal as a response to a formal declaration of war. Vorkath read both reports in his private quarters. He read them twice. Then he poured himself a glass of Drac ceremonial wine, sat down in his chair, and stared at the far wall for a while. He had a feeling. It was not a feeling he recognized from his previous conflicts. It was not fear exactly, and it was not confusion exactly. It sat somewhere between the two in a place he did not have a name for. He decided to call it concern and move on. He looked into the human species more carefully over the following days, and he read every piece of data his scouts had gathered. He studied their history, their conflicts with each other, their technology, their behavior patterns. The more he read, the more the feeling grew. Humans had been fighting wars among themselves for thousands of years, long before they had left their home planet, long before they had met any other species. They had fought over land, over water, over beliefs, over borders that they themselves had drawn. They had developed weapons of extraordinary destructive power and then spent centuries arguing about whether to use them. They had come very close to destroying themselves more than once and had somehow not done it. What struck Vornk most was not how much humans fought, it was how they fought. There was no pattern he could pin down, no consistent strategy, no single philosophy. In some of their greatest military victories had come from breaking their own previously accepted rules. Some of their worst defeats had come from following rules too rigidly. They seemed to treat every conflict as something new, something that needed to be figured out fresh, without assuming that the old ways would still apply. This was to Von CTH's highly ordered mind genuinely alarming. He considered recalling Zeth-No and handling the situation himself. He decided against it. 30 ships against a handful of patched together human vessels was still 30 ships. The math had not changed. Codex was still the Codex. Whatever the humans thought about it was not relevant. Rules did not stop being rules. because someone chose not to read them. On the 6th day, one of ZTH-Nor's scouts reported something unusual. When the human vessels had moved, they were no longer in defensive positions near their home planet. They had spread out. Some of them had gone dark, no signals, no emissions, as if they had simply switched off. ZTH filed a third report. He asked for guidance. Vor sent back a single line: follow the codex, engage at dawn on day 7. He told himself everything was fine. He almost believed it. On the morning of the 7th day, ZTH-No's fleet moved forward. The system was quiet, almost too quiet. ZTH began his standard sensor sweep, looking for the human defensive formation that should have been waiting. For him, it was not there. The humans were not defending. They were not where they were supposed to be at all. What happened next became the subject of the most talked about military report in Trekkie history, but that story belonged to Day 7, and Day 7 had only just begun. The 7th day started quietly, and then it stopped being quiet. Very fast, ZTH-Noir moved his 30 ships into the human system, expecting to find what every other species had given him: a defensive formation near the home planet, shields active, a nervous opening transmission asking if there was still time to negotiate. It was the same thing every time. He had done this 11 times in his career. He knew exactly what came next. What he found instead was empty space where the human ship should have been, and a sensor reading that made his navigation officer ask him to please come look at the screen personally, because she did not want to say the words out loud. The humans were not defending their home planet. They were already deep inside the space where ZTHN's fleet had been positioned the night before. They had moved during the night, all of them quietly, without any signals, without any emissions his sensors could detect. They had slipped through the dark between the stars and placed themselves directly behind his fleet's expected line of advance. The humans had used the 7-day notice period to attack. ZTH-Nor filed a report in the middle of the engagement. This was unusual. Most commanders waited until after the battle. He could not wait. He needed someone at Central Command to know what was happening, because he was genuinely not sure he was reading the situation correctly. The human force was led by a ship called the Defiant Cause. Behind it came 14 other vessels, all of them smaller, all of them visibly patched together from different materials. Some of the hull plating did not even match. One ship had a long dent along its side that looked like it had been repaired with a completely different kind of metal painted over, but still clearly visible. Another had its name written in large letters along the hull. Not done yet. Commanding the forward wing was Lieutenant Commander Paula Hartley. Thor did not know her name yet. He would learn it later when he reviewed the intercepted communications. During the battle, he only knew her by her ship, which flew ahead of the others and moved in ways that his tactical officers kept describing as irregular. Irregular was a polite word for it. Paula Hartley did not follow engagement patterns. She did not fly in formation. She did not maintain the standard distances between ships that allowed for coordinated fire. She moved her wing of ships independently, each one doing something slightly different, and somehow they were all still working together without any of the coordination Protocols that Dreki tactics were built around his officers could not predict where any individual human ship would be. 30 seconds from now, this made targeting extremely difficult. The first exchange of fire went roughly as expected. Draki weapons were more powerful, human shields were weaker. Two of the smaller human ships took heavy damage and fell back. ZTHN thought this was the beginning of the end. He started preparing the standard terms of surrender to transmit once the human formation broke. Then the two damaged human ships did something that stopped the entire battle. They exploded, but they did not explode the way ships exploded when they were destroyed. They exploded on purpose in a very specific direction at a very specific moment into a dense field of debris that had been floating in that part of space for what his analysts later determined was possibly centuries. Old rock and metal drifting, the kind of thing ships always navigated around, the kind of thing no one ever thought of as a weapon, because the Codex of Engagement specifically said in Rule 17 that the environment of space, natural debris fields, asteroid clusters, planetary rings could not be used as an offensive weapon during formal engagement. The deliberate detonation of the two human ships sent the debris field moving fast directly into the path of ZTH Nor's lead cruiser. The cruiser took damage, real damage, the kind of damage that was going to require significant repair time. The battle paused, not because either side called for a pause, it just paused the way battles sometimes do after something happens that nobody was ready for. Both sides sat in space and there was a moment of complete stillness. ZTHN opened a direct channel to the defiant cause. He was calm, he was professional. He pointed out clearly and without raising his voice that the deliberate use of a debris field as an offensive weapon was a direct violation of Rule 17 of the Codex of Engagement, which was a document agreed upon by over 200 civilizations and had been in effect for more than 4 centuries. The response came from a human named Eddie Graves, and he sounded cheerful. He said he had never heard of the Codex of Engagement. He asked if ZTH Noir could send a copy because it sounded interesting. He also asked whether Rule 17 had anything to say about using enemy ships as battering rams, because that was something they had been thinking about trying. Zthor closed the channel. He sat in his command chair for 11 seconds. His second officer later reported this in her own account of the battle, noting the 11 seconds specifically because in her entire career she had never seen ZTH No sit still and say nothing for that long. Then he ordered a tactical retreat, not a full withdrawal, a strategic repositioning. That was what he called it in his report, and he used that phrase 3 times to make sure the distinction was clear. While the Draki fleet was repositioning, his communications team intercepted several exchanges between the human ships. Most of them were tactical, some of them were not. In one exchange, a voice that his translators identified as belonging to Captain Dan Holloway said cheerfully that everyone owed Eddie Graves a drink because the debris idea had actually worked. In another exchange, Paula Hartley was heard telling someone to stop celebrating and patch the hull before they lost any more atmosphere. ZTHN included all of these in his report. He felt they were relevant. Back at Draki Central Command, Vorkth read the report in full, then he read it Again, he paid particular attention to the part about the debris field and the part about Eddie Graves never having heard of the Codex, and the part where Graves asked whether ramming was permitted, and he called a brief meeting with his senior staff. He asked them a simple question: had any of them in their combined military experience ever encountered a species that had reached interstellar travel without learning the Codex of Engagement? No one had. He asked a second question: was it possible that the humans knew about the Codex and were simply pretending not to? His intelligence officer said she was looking into it. She reported back 2 hours later. Based on all available data, the humans had genuinely never encountered the Codex. They had been developing their own informal rules of engagement based on their own long history of warfare, and those rules looked almost nothing like the Codex. They were messier, more flexible, more willing to adapt on the fly. Vorkth asked her if that made them easier or harder to fight, and she did not answer right away. That told him what he needed to know. He sent a message to Zthor. He told him to hold position, observe, and file detailed reports. Do not engage again without direct authorization. He wanted more information before the next move. Zthnor sent back a one-line reply, confirming he understood. Then 4 hours later he sent another report. In it he noted that the human ships had not retreated after the engagement. They were still there, still in the space between the two fleets. One of them was clearly undergoing repairs. Another appeared to be restocking something from a supply vessel. A third had gone dark again, the way they had gone dark before the battle, and no one could tell where exactly it was. And somewhere out there, Eddie Graves was presumably still thinking about the ramming idea. Ivor CTH poured himself another glass of ceremonial wine. He did not enjoy it as much as usual. Vorkth had always believed that power was its own language. You did not need to explain it. You did not need to describe it. You simply showed it, and the other side understood. That was how the galaxy worked. That was how it had always worked. He arrived at the outer rim with the full Drakai Grand Armada, 200 warships, the largest military force ever assembled in that region of space. Ships so large that some of them blocked out the light from the nearest star when they moved in formation. The combined firepower of the fleet was enough to reduce a medium-sized moon to rubble under an hour. Every civilization that had ever seen the Grand Armada had responded the same way, with immediate, complete, total willingness to discuss terms on whatever basis Vorkth preferred. He broadcast the formal request for parley. He did not demand it. He did not threaten. He simply stated calmly that he was willing to meet with a human representative to discuss the terms of the conflict, and that he expected said representative within a reasonable period of time. Then he waited, surrounded by 200 warships, for the humans to understand what they were looking at. The human representative arrived 40 minutes later. She came in a single shuttle, one shuttle small, slightly dented on the left side, with the words "Defiant Cause Diplomatic" attachment painted along the hull in letters that were not entirely straight. On the shuttle docked at the designated neutral coordinates with no hesitation and no apparent awareness that it was surrounded by the most powerful military fleet in the outer rim. Her name was Nena Flores. She held the rank of colonel. She walked off the shuttle carrying a large flat tray covered with food items wrapped in different colored materials, and behind her came a man named Sergeant Lou Baxter, who was already eating one of the food items and holding a small handheld device that he appeared to be using to take notes. Vork stared at them for a long moment. Neither of them seemed to notice. Nina Flores looked around the room, identified a flat surface near the side of the chamber, walked over to it and set down the tray, and then she turned to Vaughn Keith with a pleasant expression and asked if his staff would like some food because she had brought plenty. She described several of the items. One of them, she said, was called a breakfast wrap, and it was very good. Cold. The 11-second silence that ZTH Noir had reported was apparently a Drakai family trait. Vork stood completely still for what his aide later recorded as 14 seconds. Then he said in his most formal voice that he had not invited her here for food. He had invited her here to discuss terms of engagement, and he wished to begin immediately. Nina Flores said that was completely fine. She pulled out a chair, sat down, and waited. Vorks began. He laid out the Dreki position clearly and in full. The territory in question was strategically important to the Dominion, and the human presence in the Outer Rim was an obstacle to Draka expansion. The Grand Armada had been assembled not as a threat but as a demonstration of the seriousness with which the Dominion regarded this matter. He expected the humans to consider their options carefully, keeping in mind the nature of those options, and to respond with proposals that reflected a realistic understanding of the current situation. He paused to let the weight of the speech settle. Nina Flores nodded. Then she asked a question. She asked why the Drakai wanted the territory. Vorkoth blinked. In 40 years of conducting negotiations, no one had ever asked him that. The territory was valuable. That was obvious. That was why they were here. He said this. She asked what made it valuable specifically. Was it the resources, the location? Is the strategic depth it provided against other potential threats? Because if it was resources, she said, there might be some options worth looking at. If it was location, that was a different conversation. If it was about strategic depth, well, then they might actually be interested in the same thing, which would be useful to know. Vork told her it was primarily strategic positioning. She nodded again and pulled out a folded piece of paper from her jacket. She unfolded it on the table. It was a hand-drawn diagram. It appeared to show the Outer Rim region with markings in at least 4 different colors of ink. She tapped a circled area on the diagram and said that if strategic positioning was the main concern, and then a shared navigation corridor through this region here might actually give the DRA better tactical coverage than full sovereignty over the contested zone, because the geometry worked out better from this angle. She had drawn it out. She showed him. Vorks looked at the diagram. Then he looked at her. Then he looked back at the diagram. Lub Baxter finished his food item and opened another one. The negotiation continued for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, every time Vork presented a Drakai demand, Nina Flores did not refuse it. She did not argue with it. She asked a question about it. Why this specific boundary line? Who decided this particular resource allocation was fair? Had anyone considered the transit implications of this shipping route? Could she show him something on the diagram? The diagram grew more complicated as the hours passed. She borrowed a writing tool from one of Vorncott's aides and added more markings. She circled things. She drew arrows. At one point she drew a small box in the corner that said possible solution area with a question mark and then drew a line from it to several other points on the diagram. It was not the way any civilization in the known galaxy conducted diplomatic negotiations. There were proper forms, proper language, proper procedures. You stated your position, the other side stated theirs. You applied pressure, they conceded ground. Eventually one side won. This was how it worked. Nina Flores did not appear to know that. Lou Baxter, somewhere in the second hour, put down his notes, leaned back in his chair, and fell asleep. Not quietly, and he made a small sound when he fell asleep. Vaughn CTH noticed. He said nothing. At the end of the 3 hours, nothing was resolved. No agreement had been reached. No terms had been set, but somehow the conversation had not felt like a failure. It had felt like something else, something Vaughn Kath could not quite identify, like a puzzle that had not been solved yet, but where he now understood the shape of the pieces better than he had before. Nina Flores stood up. She said she thought this had been very productive, and she looked forward to continuing. She picked up the tray. Most of the food items were still on it. She offered them to Vaughn Kath again. He declined. She left them anyway on the side table and walked back to her shuttle with Lou Baxter, who had woken up as soon as she had stood and was now looking at his notes with a focused expression. Vorkoth went directly to his private office and sat down. He wrote his report. That night, he described everything: the tray of food, the hand-drawn diagram, the questions, the way she never refused anything but made every demand seem somehow more complicated than it had been before he said it out loud. The way Lou Baxter had fallen asleep without it apparently being a problem for anyone, including Lou Baxter. At the end of the report, he wrote one line of analysis. It said, human negotiators do not appear to understand the traditional power dynamic of formal diplomacy. They seem comfortable anyway. This is somehow more unsettling than open defiance. He sent the report to Central Command. Say. Then he looked at the food items still sitting on the side table. After a moment, he picked one up. He looked at it for a while, then he tried it. He did not include this in the report. The reports had become famous, not officially famous. No one at Draka Central Command had announced that Vaughn CTH's dispatches from the outer rim were required reading. No one had circulated them through official channels, but somehow over the course of several months, every officer in the building had read them. Copies had been passed from desk to desk, from mess hall to briefing room, from senior staff down to the junior officers who filed documents and made tea. The report about Eddie Graves asking for a copy of the Codex had been reprinted by hand 17 times, as someone had attached it to the wall of the Eastern Mesh Hall before anyone noticed, and took it down, by which point everyone had already read it. The report about Lou Baxter falling asleep during the diplomatic parley had been read aloud at 2 separate social gatherings that Vornk knew nothing about. People thought they were funny. The humans were funny. Their behavior was strange and confused and completely backwards, and reading about it from the dry, precise language that Vaughn CTH used made it somehow funnier. He never Tried to be funny in his reports. He never exaggerated. He described exactly what had happened in plain formal language, and somehow that made the whole thing worse, better, funnier. It was hard to say. High Counselor Brex V was not laughing. The Brex V was the oldest member of the Dreki ruling council and had been in service to the Dominion for longer than some small civilizations had existed. He had seen everything. He had been amused by very little for a very long time. He had read all of Voreth's reports carefully, twice each, and had come to some conclusions that he wanted to discuss in person. He summoned Vorketh back to Central Command for a formal review. The council chamber was full when Vorkth arrived. 12 counselors, senior military advisors, the heads of the intelligence and strategic planning divisions, everyone who mattered was in the room. Some of them were smiling, a few were clearly trying not to. Rixval was doing neither. Vorkth stood before them and delivered his full report, not a summary, the full thing, every incident, every violation, every confused dispatch from Zethner, every strange detail from the parley. He had organized it for the purpose of this presentation as a list. He went through the Codex of Engagement rule by rule, and for each rule he named the specific human and the specific moment in which that rule had been broken. He started with Rule 12. Rule 12 stated that no hostile action could be taken without a formal declaration of engagement during the declared conflict period. It was one of the foundational rules. Every species understood that the declared periods were the periods of conflict. Outside those periods, no action was taken. Human named Lieutenant Kyle Marsh had attacked a Dreki supply convoy between two official battle periods. When ZTH Noir had contacted him and pointed out that this was outside the conflict window, Akil Marsh had explained that no one had told him the convoy was off limits. He had seen it. It had supplies on it. He had acted accordingly. He sounded, Vorkth noted in his report, genuinely confused about what the problem was. A few counselors smiled. Brex V did not. Vorkth moved to Rule 29. Rule 29 stated that non-combatants, support personnel, engineers, medical staff were not to be placed in or near active combat roles during engagement. This was a protection as much as a restriction. It kept the people who kept ships running from being pulled into the fighting itself. A human civilian engineer named Carl Odom had been on a damaged vessel during an engagement when the weapons officer was injured. Carl Odom had fixed the weapon system because that was his job then, and because the weapons officer was still injured and the weapons were now working, he had stayed and operated them himself. He had continued operating them for the remainder of the engagement. He had by all accounts done this very effectively when asked about it. Afterward, Carl Odom said he thought it needed to be done, so he had done it. The smiling in the chamber was quieter. Now, Vorkth moved to Rule 44. Rule 44 stated that combatants must clearly identify their rank to enemy forces during formal engagement so that communications could be properly directed and command structures could be understood. This was a basic rule. It allowed conflicts to be managed at the right levels. It prevented confusion. Humans did not appear to observe rank the way the Codex described. This was not because they did not have ranks. They had ranks. The problem was that During combat, the ranks seemed to function more as suggestions than as hard boundaries. Vorath had a collection of intercepted human communications to illustrate this point. In one exchange, a lower-ranked crew member named Private Drawweb had told her superior officer directly to please stop talking and just trust her on this. One, because she had done this before and it was going to work. The superior officer had listened to her. In another exchange, Captain Dan Holloway had asked a technician 3 levels below him for advice on a tactical decision and had followed that advice without question. When someone had later asked Holloway about the chain of command, he had said that in his experience the chain of command was a tool, not a wall, and you used the tool that worked. But Vorko read this line aloud to the council. The chamber was completely quiet. He moved through 10 more rules. Each one had a name attached to it. Each name had a story. The stories were not funny anymore, not when you heard them all together in order like this, one by one. They were strange anecdotes about a confused alien species that did not know the rules. Altogether they were something else. They were a pattern. When he finished, Brex V asked him one question. He asked, "Are they doing this on purpose?" The room waited. Vork had thought about this question for a long time. He had thought about it every time he read a new report. He had thought about it during the parley, watching Nina Flores draw on her diagram. He had thought about it at night in his quarters and going back over every exchange and every strange decision and every moment where a human had done something completely unexpected and then acted as if it was perfectly normal. He answered honestly. He said, "I do not know, and I think that is the point." The silence that followed was different from the silence before the room had been quiet, the way rooms go quiet when someone is about to say something important. Now it was quiet the way rooms go quiet when something important has already been said and everyone is sitting with it. Brex looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the table. One of the junior counselors, a younger officer named VTH Salo, who had been smiling at the earlier parts of the report, was no longer smiling. He was looking at his notes, and he had written something down during the part about Carl Odom and had been staring at it ever since. He said quietly that he had a question. He asked whether a species that had never been given the Codex could still be held responsible for violating it. No one answered right away. It was a simple question. It had a simple answer. Technically, the Codex applied to all spacefaring civilizations. That was what it said. Contact with the Codex was not required for the Codex to apply. That was the rule. But sitting in that room after that report with the names of Kyle Marsh and Carl ODM and Eddie Graves and Draw Webb still hanging in the air, the simple answer felt less simple than it usually did. Vorkth gathered his papers. He told the council he would prepare recommendations for next steps and submit them within the week. He walked out of the chamber with the same steady, precise step he always used. In the corridor outside, he stopped for a moment. He stood there, alone, and thought about Nina Flores, drawing on her diagram and asking questions nobody had thought to ask. He thought about Lou Baxter sleeping in his chair without embarrassment. He thought about Dan Holloway sending a picture of a small furry animal as a response to a formal declaration of war. He thought about all of it, and then he walked on The recommendations he submitted that week did not involve further military action. They involved something else, something the Dreki had not tried before. With a species they were in conflict with, they involved listening. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Vorkth had not expected a letter. He had expected, if anything, another request for a parley or possibly another unusual image transmitted through the communications array or given recent history, a visit from Lou Baxter with snacks. He had not expected a letter, actual written correspondence, transmitted digitally but composed in the style of something written by hand, addressed to him personally and marked at the top, for the commander who keeps filing reports about us. He read that line twice, then he kept reading. Letter was from Nina Flores. She opened by saying that she had heard about the reports. The humans, she explained, had intercepted a number of Dreki internal communications over the course of the conflict. She said this without apology, in the same straightforward tone she used for everything. And several of Vorkath's reports had come through. She said she had read all of them and she found them very accurate, she wrote, and also, if she was being honest, very funny, not in a mean way, in a way that she thought suggested he had a genuine talent for observation, and that if things had gone differently, she thought he might have made a good journalist. Vorkth read that line 3 times. She then moved to the actual point of the letter, which she reached quickly and without any of the formal diplomatic language he was used to. She proposed peace not on human terms, not on Dreki terms, on what she called practical terms. She laid them out clearly, one by one, the way she had laid things out on her diagram during the parley. A trade agreement covering 3 resource categories that both sides actually needed, a shared navigation corridor through the outer rim, are running along the same route she had marked on her diagram, with that small circled area that said possible solution area, mutual non-aggression clause, a framework for handling what she described as occasional misunderstandings which seem inevitable given the circumstances. That included a process for talking through disagreements before they became anything larger. She said she thought both sides had better things to do than keep fighting over a region of space that neither of them actually wanted to live in, and that if the Dreki were open to it, she would very much like to stop spending her days explaining Eddie Graves to alien military commanders. Vorkth read the whole letter twice. Slowly, then he looked at the final paragraph. She had enclosed a gift with the letter, or rather, as she had attached a digital file that she described as a gift. She said that after receiving ZTH-Nor's transmission about the Codex of Engagement, the humans had made a point of obtaining a full copy. She said they had all read it. She wanted to return a copy to Vorkath as a gesture of respect for the document that had clearly meant a great deal to the Dreki for a very long time. The file was a scanned copy of the Codex of Engagement. Vorkath opened it. It was the full codex, every page, every rule, every footnote, all 412 pages of it. It was also clearly a copy that had been read by a great many humans. Almost every page had marks on it, notes in the margins, questions written in small, cramped handwriting. Some pages had multiple people's notes on them in different handwriting and different colors of ink, me occasionally responding to each other. One note beside Rule 3 said, "This is reasonable. A different handwriting. Beside it said, "Is it though?" Why this? Specific distance, a third handwriting. Had drawn a small arrow between the two. Notes and written, good question. Beside Rule 7, which governed the required notification period before any change in engagement status someone had. Written simply no in large letters and underlined it twice, almost every page. Had something questions, observations, agreements, disagreements, the occasional drawing near the back. Someone had written a summary of the whole document in what appeared to be their own words, covering 4 pages in dense handwriting which began, "Okay." So basically this whole thing is about making war more organized, which is a reasonable goal. But some of these rules seem more about tradition than about actually making things better, and it might be worth asking which one still makes sense. Lou Baxter had signed the inside front cover. Below his name he had written the date and the words. Finished it, some good parts. Vork sat with the file open on his screen for a long time. He did not do anything, he just sat there going through the pages, reading the notes. At some point one of his aides came in to ask if he needed anything, and he said no without looking up. Eventually he closed the file. He thought about what Nina Flores had written. He thought about the practical terms she had laid out. He thought about the navigation corridor on her diagram and how the geometry actually had worked out the way she said it would, and how he had looked at it in the parley chamber and not been able to argue with the math. He signed the peace agreement. The following morning, he did not make a ceremony of it. He signed it, had his seal placed on it, and transmitted it back through official channels with a cover note that confirmed Dracai's acceptance of the proposed terms and requested that the finalized document be sent to him directly. Then he sat down and wrote one more report. This one was not for ZTH nor, and it was not for the Standard Military Archive. It was addressed to the full Dracai High Council, every fleet commander in the Dominion, and the heads of all 7 strategic planning divisions. He titled it simply, Observations on the Human Species, a Corrective to Prior Assumptions. He wrote it carefully. He did not try to be funny. He did not try to be alarming. He tried to be accurate the way he always tried to be accurate, and he trusted that accuracy to do the work on its own. He wrote about how the humans had never been given the codex and had therefore never been shaped by it. He wrote about how every other civilization the Dracai had encountered had grown up inside the same framework, the same rules, the same assumptions about how conflict worked, and how those shared assumptions made everyone predictable in ways that were usually not noticed because everyone was equally predictable. He wrote about how the humans coming from outside that framework entirely were not predictable in those ways, and how unpredictability of that kind was not the same as chaos or randomness. It was something more specific than that, and he wrote they did not shatter our rules out of arrogance or ignorance. They simply never accepted that the rules existed in the first place. Going forward, I recommend we treat this not as a flaw, but as a warning. The final recommendation in the report was that the Codex of Engagement be reviewed for the first time in 400 years. This recommendation was accepted by the Council 6 weeks later. The review process began shortly after. It took 18 months. It was the longest formal Revision process in Draka history. Nina. Flores was invited to attend the final revision ceremony. She came, she brought food, she sat in the chamber and listened quietly through most of the proceedings and only spoke twice. The first time was to ask a question about Rule 7, which she said she was glad to see was being reconsidered, and the second time was to ask High Counselor BV very politely whether the DRAI had ever thought about making the codex shorter. She said shorter rules got read more often. She had data on this. She said if he wanted to see it, Brex Val said he did not want to see it at this time, but he thought about it for several days. Afterward, more than he expected to. Several rules were removed from the codex during the revision. Rule 7 was among them. The document that emerged from the process was 30 pages shorter than the one that had gone in. It was by every account clearer and more practical than the version before it. Vorkath retired 2 years after the peace agreement was signed. He was given a formal ceremony, a commendation, and the customary farewell honors of his rank. He accepted all of it graciously and then went home and started writing. His memoir took 3 years. It was written in his native language in the careful and precise style he had always used for his reports, and it covered his entire career, from his first command to the Outer Rim conflict to the Codex revision. He titled it himself in Draki. When it was finished and distributed, Dan Holloway sent him a personal message asking if he could arrange for an English translation. He said he wanted to give copies to his crew. He said they had heard about the reports and felt they deserved to see the full picture. Vorkth arranged the translation. It took 8 months. The translator, a Dreki linguist who had spent decades studying human languages, said it was the most interesting project she had ever worked on, and the English title was Holloway's suggestion. He sent it in a short message with no explanation, just the words, "Call it this." The title was "The Funniest War I Ever Lost." Vor CTH approved it without hesitation. It was, he had to admit, accurate. The book sold very well on Earth. It sold less well elsewhere in the galaxy, where most readers found it a little too honest about the limits of the Codex and a little too warm about a species that had spent several months shooting at Dreki ships with debris fields. But on Earth, it sold well. Humans, it turned out, liked to read about people who looked at them clearly and told the truth about what they saw, even when, especially when the truth was funny.